Today I am with Dan Annear, and Dan, you are a counselor and you immigrated to the US from Australia recently, and we corresponded about some issues around COVID as well as some of the issues within the counseling work that you do and professionally. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your experiences and your perspective. So would you mind starting off by just saying a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thanks for having me. It's really fun. I saw your video and one of your videos, and the one that probably a lot of people have seen on the pronoun topic, and I just thought, oh, she really just explained that in a succinct way. So I thought I'd reach out, and here we are. Yeah, so I've been in the US. We're currently in Minnesota. I've been here since September last year. My wife is Minnesotan, and yeah, I've been here, yeah, for about a year now. And we have three kids. And yeah, we moved here from Adelaide, South Australia, which is where I'm from, which is where I was born and spent my whole life. And yeah, been married to my wife for 13 years now, and we spent that whole time living in Adelaide in Australia. And so moving back was a really big thing. As you said, I'm a relationship counselor primarily. That's what I stumbled in. It wasn't ever my plan. I always wanted to be a counselor, and I've always worked in sort of some kind of helping people industry. But yeah, shortly after starting my private practice in Australia, I had a couple come in, and yeah, it was just this revelation. It was like, oh, I love this. It just fits me really naturally, really organically. Which I'm really lucky about because, as you know, I suspect, most counselors, therapists, psychologists don't want to work with couples. They're like, oh, I don't want to touch that, right? And so I was like, okay, I've got a passion and there's a hole in the market, and let's go down that journey. And so I've been doing that for some years now, and I really enjoy it. So I did that in Australia, and I'm doing that here in Minnesota as well.
Mhm. Well, yeah, that's really interesting what you say about couples, and it just fit for you. I have not worked with couples very much. I did some training when I was in graduate school, and I have worked with families a little bit, but I think that this for me, I'm still very new in this whole process of practicing what I call coaching, and
Yeah.
is not licensed counseling, but working with people. And I find it sort of intimidating to work in that dynamic.
Yeah.
I find it challenging to work with, multiple people in the room. So it's really interesting that it just fit for you.
Hmm.
What do you find to be really rewarding about that work?
Yeah, well, I'll answer the question you didn't quite ask, but maybe implied. I was actually kind of set up to work with couples unintentionally
Mm.
because I have a background in Australia. I worked what they call a support worker, so it's essentially boots on the ground with clients, and I work with a whole range. So I work with youth for a while. So that's kids under the guardianship of the minister that have been removed from their family,
Mm, mm,
highly traumatized. I did the same type of role in disability, and I did the same type of role with clients with mental health issues. And all three of those, but especially the youth work, you're dealing with multiple personalities in the room. You're
mm,
dealing with heightened situations. I spent a bit over a year working with a young man who was 10, and it was just myself and a co-worker plus him.
mm,
So he always had two staff.
mm,
And so I think I'm probably naturally wired to be able to manage
mm,
different people's emotions and try and it feels a bit like a chess game, right? Or what should I do? What should I say? I want to keep everyone calm. But then I was like just thoroughly immersed in that.
mm,
How do I stop my young person from escalating yet make sure he eats his breakfast or gets ready for school or whatever it is? And so when I had a couple come in, and the first few couples, while I was still learning, it escalated a little, right? They started arguing in front of me, and part of
mm,
me is like, oh my goodness, like, there, and but a bigger part of me was just like, I can do this.
mm.
Like, I've had youth like smash windows in front of me and like bash holes in the door, and
Wow. Yeah.
and so yeah, really intense. Now, granted, they generally weren't of any risk to me because I was
Hmm.
working with younger people, still pretty full on.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that sort of set me up for it. But specifically your question, yeah, I find it really rewarding to manage the emotional dynamics in the room, manage the energy. There's an energy between a couple, getting a bit esoteric, but it's like there's the one person, the other person. There's kind of like an energy that they create.
Hmm.
And so what I like about couples as opposed to singles is I feel like I can use that energy, right?
Hmm.
It's like, okay, they're arguing, but that means there's some passion there. That means there's some buy-in. That means there's some care. So like, I can see you really feel it. Like it's great. It shows that you still care about each other. You're still and so you kind of manage that energy,
Hmm.
while simultaneously going, what am I doing? Where am I going? What should I say? Should I do some self-disclosure? Should I use this technique?
Hmm.
And I've studied personality typology as well. So that's one of my other passions. Actually, I didn't study it to work with couples, but once I started working with couples, I was like, man, this is brilliant. This is perfect. Like,
Hmm.
and I've come to realize not many people are using personality typology working with couples, maybe because it's been kind of poo-pooed as not being scientific or
Hmm.
evidence-based,
Hmm.
which actually has changed in the last handful of years. So I'll bring that in as well. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that background.
Yeah,
And
no worries.
so you said your practice is relatively new, like it was just a few years old when COVID hit and
Yeah.
things started to change. So could you talk a little bit about that? What was that process? Because I know at some point during the COVID lockdowns, you decided to move to the US. Was that in response
Yes,
to what was going on in Australia?
it was. Yes, it was directly in response. Yeah.
Mm.
So 2020, so 2020
Mhm.
when it all
Mhm.
began, um, I've had a bit of a background in personally around like alternative health measures because I've had my own health issues and I kind of
Mhm.
like went to the doctors, went mainstream, and they couldn't help me, and in many instances didn't even have a try of helping, right? And then I had a doctor who said you could go see this osteopath, which is in Australia. That's quite a bit similar to a chiropractor. A bit, I think they're quite kind of
Yeah.
different here. Uh, I don't really know what it's all about, but I've sent some of my patients there and it seems to have helped. And so that sort of started me on a journey from going mainstream to more alternative
Mhm.
modalities. And I'd cleaned up my diet. And anyway, it's a whole nother story. But this all happened years before COVID. And so I already had a different paradigm on health, on wellness, on the human person, on psychology and all that. And so when COVID came down and like had my own perspectives on um, how the pharmaceutical industry was exerting a lot of power and a lot of influence
Mhm.
over well, really all levels of the health system. And so when COVID started, I spent my about the first 3 weeks in a bit of a haze. I remember walking around, and I was doing mental health type of work at that point, and I was helping a young man with schizophrenia do his shopping, and I was absorbing this anxious energy from everyone because I'm
Mhm.
very sensitive like that. Um, and I was in a haze for about 3 weeks, and then I finally realized, I kind of shifted it. I was like, what's happening? But I realized, oh, these people are like, they're worried. They're like
Mhm.
worried about this virus, right?
Mhm.
They're legitimately scared. Ah, because I was worried and legitimately scared, but for a totally different reason. My
Mhm.
my my brain was future projecting, going, this is a power grab. Like
Mhm.
government is
Mhm.
going to use this opportunity, and I wasn't necessarily thinking it had been created and engineered to be this way. I didn't have a view on that. I was just like, I know what governments do with crises. They take them and use them to their own ends. And so anyway, the reason I'm mentioning this is quite early on, I started whispering to my wife. I was like, maybe we should maybe we should think about going to America because I don't know where this is going. And we pretty seriously discussed it. We talked to American family about it. I think I said before my wife's Minnesotan. Um, and we were making plans to get in the car and drive to Melbourne. We're from Adelaide. Melbourne's about 9 hours away. Get in the car, drive to Melbourne, and get our three kids their American citizenship, their passport, their citizenship. Just to be careful, right? And I felt like, yeah, I'm kind of seeing where this is going, and I'm being proactive. And then just like that, they locked down our borders
Oh,
really
wow.
early on. I'd love to
Wow.
go back and look at the dates because I don't recall, but it was around the middle of 2020 that they're like, no one's leaving South Australia, my state, South Australia. No one's going out, no one's going in.
So you couldn't go to Melbourne.
I couldn't go to Melbourne. We couldn't do it. And then George Floyd happened, and there was all this crazy stuff going on in the US, and we're like seeing it on the screens. We're seeing rioting, we're seeing burning, and so we had a moment of just like, and I was allowed to work. I was still working. I can't remember when I started my private practice, but it was only small. I was still working a lot in the disability sector, so I was considered an essential worker, and so was my wife. She was doing the same type of work. So we just put our heads down and we just, kind of kept doing our thing. And I was still taking in information, trying to understand what was happening in the world. But so I had a while there where it was like, okay, maybe we'll just sit tight. This is long before the vaccines came online. This is long before that stuff happened. It was just COVID. So my life was able to go on fairly much as normal in Adelaide at that point. So yeah, I don't know if that sort of half answers your question. But
No, it's really interesting. It
yeah.
sounds like it was when you described this realization that people were really scared of this virus. It sounds like your anxieties were in what are they beating the drums for here? What's going on? I'm suspicious that there's going to be, as you said, a power grab. And so when you were kind of watching this develop and you looked around you and realized people are legitimately scared of this virus, what was that perspective shift like for you? Were you surprised that people were buying this and taking this in so seriously?
Yeah, I basically was like, oh, they've overplayed their hand because I could see that there was an agenda to try and get all the all the children vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the childhood vaccine schedule had been growing and growing and growing.
Mm-hmm.
As you're probably well aware, the amount of
Mm-hmm.
vaccines that kids get now compared to like in the
Yeah.
80s, like when we were children. And so, sort of in that world, in that space,
Mm-hmm.
we were often talking about the fact that they'd love to get all the adults vaccinated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in Australia, they were starting to push the flu vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And at that time, they started to make it mandatory for aged care employees to get the flu vaccine. So
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't get that, you lost your job. And so when this all happened, I could see what was happening. And I'm like, oh, they've overplayed their hand because the momentum has been building with this movement, and people are starting to realize, hey, the science of vaccines might be okay, but the way in which they're testing them is certainly not as rigorous or as thorough as we'd been led to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I was like, oh, they've overplayed their hand and people are going to see this. Now, I didn't expect everyone to realize, of course not. But I expected a lot more to realize
Mm-hmm.
quite quickly. And I really was very surprised just how successful they were at getting people to, stand on the lines and
Mm-hmm.
social
Mm-hmm.
distance. And we didn't have to wear masks at first in Adelaide, but, wearing masks, even as the science started to come out that like, hey, maybe they're not working. And, yeah. So short answer is I was surprised. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I felt sort of similarly to you in that regard. Like I didn't expect people to buy into this to the extent that they did. And I also saw, and my oldest daughter was injured by a vaccine in 2008 or 9, and it caused me to do a lot more thinking and take them more seriously, take these pharmaceutical products more seriously, and look at each one with a risk benefit analysis rather than just, oh, sure, whatever the doctor's recommending and whatever the standard schedule is, let's do that. I now realize that there's individual differences in people's physiology that might cause people to be more susceptible to injury from viruses or from vaccines or from any agent, that you're exposed to. So I had a rethinking of this, and I'd since been more tuned into discussions around vaccine mandates and the increasing vaccine schedule. And so for me, watching the COVID thing start to develop and the way that it was being talked about, I really read it as a vaccine campaign from the beginning. And as you said, a way to get an adult mandate. Yeah. I saw that because it had been something people were talking about in the vaccine risk awareness community, really.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I read that the same way I think that you did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And for context, it just bears mentioning where I'm from. Mm-hmm. By the time COVID came in, we had a situation that if your children weren't fully up to date with the vaccines, which means you have to take all the ones they dictate in the order that they dictate them. And if you decide, for example, hey, I'm not worried about chickenpox, so I'm going to do all of them, but I'm going to leave chickenpox, then you're considered, your child's considered not up to date. And for those families, by the time COVID came in, those families were losing some welfare payments, so some parenting payments. So it was about $30 every week, and most families in Australia would get some sort of.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It adds
up.
That's
$120 a month.
Exactly, and that's for one child, right? So if you have 2 or 3 kids or whatever, and don't quote me, but it was about that much. And then they pulled funding for childcare, so you weren't able to get the extra governmental support to go to childcare, which meant basically you had to have a stay-at-home parent. And that was something like $20,000 or $30,000 in a year that you potentially could get in reimbursements for childcare. So then they pulled. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I'm curious. Like, as you're saying, welfare and childcare reimbursements and stuff. It sounds like there's is that just a standard for Australians? Is there a lot of governmental reliance, or is it like you're taxed heavily, and then this is how you get some of your taxes back, or
Correct.
How does that work? Okay,
that's exactly how it works.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Since we've been in the US, I'm understanding that they tend to give you a tax break for having a family, whereas over there the taxes are the same, but then, depending on your circumstances, but there's a very high percentage of families that will get something. Now, the really low-income families will get significantly more, but even pretty middle-class people will still get some money. And that might only be the childcare benefit, right? They might not get anything else, but they'll get, when they send their kid off to childcare, they'll get, I don't know, something like $90 or $100 a day that they can get back.
Wow. Well, that sounds like they really encourage and create a system of where they're basically taking your money and then doling it out to you the way that, depending on your performance as a citizen.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it is a very socialist type of system. And, I think most Australians have traditionally tended to trust the government. And to be honest, I think there was pretty good reason for that for most of my life. I don't feel that way anymore. But, it's a good system when the people operating it are trustworthy. And so it was the childcare benefit. It was the family payment. And then they went the next level where they actually banned any unvaccinated child from even being able to attend childcare. Now, I need to be clear on this because I sometimes forget that people assume that this wouldn't apply to kids that can't have the vaccine for a medical reason. This was across the board, right? I think if you had a medical exemption, I'm not even sure if you could have still attended. And the reason I'm so unsure is because I've never met someone with a medical exemption. They don't give them out. They just like, I actually knew someone who had like like a court case, who had a medical exemption and was trying to get it accepted, and it wouldn't be accepted. And that's another whole subject. But it's not just like, oh, these crazy anti-vaxxers and blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, there's people with little, and I don't think they're crazy anyway, but there's people with legitimate medical issues that were getting kicked out of the system at this point. And then the last nail in the coffin, again, this is all pre-COVID, the last nail in the coffin was that they banned unvaccinated children from attending kindergarten. And that's the step before your first year of school. I don't know what you call that. What do you call that here? Pre-K? Preschool?
Yeah, preschool, yeah.
Pre-K.
So like kindergarten is usually 5 to 6 years old. Yeah.
Yeah. And they banned it mid-year.
Okay.
So kids that were already in South Australia, kids that were already in kindergarten, were already going along, were just kicked out.
Yeah.
We're the only state that did that. Everyone else grandfathered them in. Once they brought that in, they said, all right, these kids can finish the year and so on.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so there's a lot of context, but that was the context for me going into COVID. So it was like my eyes were already wide open. I was like, there's an agenda here, and it's not a scientifically based agenda.
Yeah, and I think we were really seeing that more in the mid teens, like the 2000. I don't know what year exactly, but I remember when I first realized that what was happening in my daughter's health was as a result of this shot series that she was taking. And, started talking with doctors about this and started researching what the heck I could do and what had happened. And it had not previously really been on my radar, and it had not felt like there was a political charge around this issue. And as it was something that I was aware of, I started to hear more and more. And I don't know if that's just like an availability bias or something, but I also do feel like there was a ramping up culturally of this, the propaganda around childhood vaccinations. And that seems to have really happened over the last decade or so, where we've increased, and it sounds like this was increasing in Australia, quite heavy-handed on the part of the government in terms of, let's get all these kids vaccinated, let's pressure families so that you can't refuse these. And that what's interesting about that is that that's including new vaccines that are being added to the schedule. So it might be things that we wouldn't have even been worried about when, say, you and I were kids, things that we would have had, maybe like eight shots that we were getting back then.
Maximum, I think.
And now there's 16 or 20 different viruses that we're targeting.
I used to know the numbers, but I can't remember anymore. But it's. And as you say, it's the schedule as well, right? And the schedule is not scientifically based.
No.
So the schedule in the US is different to the schedule in Australia. There's I can't remember now, but there's at least one thing that in the US is delayed that in Australia we give really early. And it's not like this schedule that's been studied to see, what's the effect on this young person's developing immune system and how much can they cope? It's just like, here's another one, let's just throw it in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an interesting topic. If maybe at some point it'd be something to dive into more deeply. I know there are plenty of places where people do a full examination of this topic, and I think it's very important. So I hope people will, if they haven't already been exposed to this conversation, go into it and research it, because I think that there's this overly simplistic labeling of people as anti-vaxxers. I don't know what that even really means. I think that there's just people who are concerned and have done some research and want to consider this a pharmaceutical product like any other, which we would have the right to make a full informed consent to. And it's been handled really coercively. So like you said, maybe you might not even question the science behind it, but the policy behind it is really, it's being handled differently than other pharmaceuticals, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
and I agree. There's lots of stuff on this out there. I'm more than happy to go into a different topic. And yeah.
Well, you mentioned that in 2020, in the middle of all this COVID stuff starting, George Floyd happened. You talked about George Floyd's death, and
yes.
And you said you're kind of watching that happen in the US. I know from talking to a few people in the UK that there was this sort of strange overlap of like United States race relations being played out in in UK. So like they were having some of these Black Lives Matter marches and things that were really kind of relevant to a US racial historical context, but not as much to the UK. At least this is the way that it felt for them. What was it like being in Australia? And did you have a similar sort of political overlap with that?
Yeah, there was. And so obviously having a wife from Minnesota and this all happening in Minnesota, it
Mm-hmm.
caught my attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I always tended to follow US politics quite closely for some years now. But yeah, they had really substantial riots or protests. It wasn't riots as far as I'm aware, but protests, George Floyd type of thing in Melbourne.
Oh, really?
And
Okay.
yeah, I can't remember the size, but it was big.
Okay.
And that was right in the middle of lockdowns. And Melbourne was the most lockdown country in the world. Or I should say, was locked down for the longest time of anywhere in the world. Really, to use an overused word, draconian,
Mm-hmm.
right? The guy who's the head of that state is really power hungry, and he really treated his people poorly. But the George Floyd protests were fine, right?
They were tolerated
Yeah, they were tolerated, even though at that time it was illegal to protest. They
wow.
literally made it illegal. That was fine. And I believe we had some in Adelaide too. I didn't go. I don't know a lot about it, and we weren't locked down at that time. But in Melbourne, they were locked down when the protests happened, and there were still, a few thousand people. And then it was only a handful of weeks later that they had anti-lockdown protests. And as I'm sure you can guess, they were less tolerant of those. And they came out and shot the peaceful protesters with rubber bullets.
I saw that. That was
And there
really
was quite a bit of
horrifying.
stuff that went viral. And that was only, I think I'm remembering rightly, that it was just a few weeks after the George Floyd protests. And we've got our own issues in Australia with Indigenous, with Aboriginal folk. Very real, very, very valid issues. I've worked in that sector. I've worked with a number of Indigenous people, and there's a lot of generational trauma there, and it's not something I want to belittle or say is not real or not important. But yeah, the hypocrisy and the disparity of how they treated, different groups of protesters only weeks apart was really confronting. And I think a lot of people observed that, right? I don't think it was lost on people.
Oh, that's really interesting to see that contrast in such a short amount of time. And what would be the justification for the disparate treatment of the protesters in those two scenarios?
It's a really good question. I don't remember exactly the line that they ran with. I probably have more recollection of what was happening in the US, right, where there were these news headlines which were trying to say, well, it's actually safer to get out on the streets and protest with the George Floyd era. I remember that was some kind of a headline, and they had some very strange logic that they were applying. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what was being said in Melbourne, but they were definitely supportive of that, despite it technically being illegal. Yeah.
That's interesting. It really sort of seems like allowing one channel for people's angst. Here, you can channel your angst into this issue, and it's forbidden in other areas. So here, it's almost an encouraging, because you've built up all this tension in the population, and now we're going to give you a place to put that. And
yes.
And yeah,
I was just listening to a commentator the other day that was referring to all this. I don't remember who it was, but they were saying a lot of the people that were out on the street protesting George Floyd, it wasn't a black issue that they were on the streets for. It was all this angst from being locked up in their house, and they finally had a sanctioned outlet for that. And I thought, yeah, it's really true. Yeah.
And so all these things are going on and you're observing all these things in your country, and you're having conversations with your wife and with her family around maybe we should go to the US. And how did that progress for you? And how did you make the decision to come over? And was it easy to get out of Australia with the lockdown
That's a good
borders?
question.
Yeah.
It's a good question. Well, we couldn't, and I can't remember exactly. I wanted to go back and work it out, but it was over a year we weren't allowed to leave. So our plan to go get those passports was literally not available to us for, well over a year. So we just went back into our routine, and we never made a decision in 2020 that we're going to move. It was an idea that came up, and then it sort of went back down, and we continued on. But yeah, as things progressed with COVID, with the vaccine rollout, eventually we were required to wear masks in Adelaide when most of the world was already stopping. We also had to. They tried two things. They tried to get every Australian in the country to install an app on their phone, which had location tracking, and they wanted everyone to have that, and they were going to track literally 25 million of us, or however many people had a phone, for the sake of knowing where COVID was spreading, right? That didn't go down so well. I think partly because the app was I don't think it was because people wouldn't put it on their phone. I think the app was pretty useless. I don't think it actually did what it was meant to do. But after a little while, they shifted tact and they went to a system where they had QR codes everywhere.
Oh, okay.
So wherever you went, whether you went to the doctor, the shop, anywhere you went, they had a QR code up, and you're meant to scan yourself in with a QR code wherever you went, so that they could track the virus, right? Track where you're going. You had the opportunity to write down your name, for elderly people that didn't have. And just the way in which I watch my fellow Australians just be like, oh, okay, the government's got our best interests at heart. Let's all let the government track us. And, they're saying, oh, of course, we won't use the data for it. We're just keeping the data for COVID purely. And I'm thinking, yeah, of course you will, Of course you're only going to use it, But everyone else, not everyone, but a very high percentage are like, yeah, no worries, I'm happy to scan in and doing it for the good of my fellow citizens, this type of thing. And of course, 18 months later, it comes out that the government gave access to location data or location data records to the police force to, pursue some criminals and pursue some cases and stuff. And, maybe people listening along think, oh, well, that's fair enough and that's fine. But it was a breach, right? They said they weren't going to do that, and they did do that. I never put the app on my phone, and I know a lot of people that didn't, who are in my kind of circles. But the average Australian was more than happy to go along with that. And I think it was through this period that I was thinking about and started to conclude the way that I now word it, right? The way I sum it up. For people that are interested why I actually left, the way I explain it to people is that what I've come to understand about America is that there's a constant battle. Battle sounds negative. It's not necessarily a negative thing, but there's a constant dynamic that's going on in American society where you go, okay, what are the individual liberties of people? What are our individual liberties, and what role should they play in a specific context? And what's the collective good? And there's this constant push-pull, right, throughout American history of, okay, how do we do collective good? We still want to respect the individual liberties. And I think that's really at the core of American society. And I came to realize that both culturally and legally, like the legal dynamics of the Australian context, that doesn't exist. It's heavily biased towards collective good. And nothing wrong with collective good, but it's like, who's deciding collective good, right? And what I came to realize was, okay, I can't trust the government. Well, we kind of knew that. But I also don't feel like I can trust my fellow Australians to stand up and to advocate for the individual liberties, for our individual liberties, and we saw these terrible things that were happening to mainly people in Melbourne, but other places, where it was an absolute government overreach, and they just became violent towards their citizens. There was also people that were forcibly removed and put into quarantine camps for their health, even though they'd tested negative to COVID. And for me, I came to realize that I'm cut from a different cloth. I'm not like a lot of these people. And there was some amazing people. There's a lady called Monica Schmidt. She started something called Reignite Democracy Australia, and she was doing brilliant advocacy. But for the most part, Australians were happy to trust the government, listen to the government, go along with the government and do what the government told them for their own good. And even on our trip to the US, when we're literally still in transit, I counted maybe 2 or 3 people along the way that made some quip about, oh, the government, oh, you can't trust the government. And, and it's in the psyche here in a way that it's not in Australia. And as I said at the beginning of our conversation, I think that was fair, right? Because I think the Australian government traditionally, I've benefited a lot. It's done a lot for me. It's not like I think there's been more corruption in the American government throughout history than Australia. It's my subjective opinion. I don't really know. So I get it. But the degree to which even now the percentage of Aussies that have woken up to this dynamic is far less than I would have hoped. And I just lost absolute faith that if and when, not probably if, but when the next time something similar happens, I can't really trust my fellow Australians. Maybe people watching would disagree. And I know some amazing people that would have my back, but on balance, it doesn't feel that way. And legally, we don't have a Bill of Rights. There's no free speech in Australia. A lady got arrested. You probably saw this one. It went viral too. She got a pregnant lady got arrested for planning the anti-lockdown protest through posting on Facebook. They came into her house. It's all on camera. They arrested her and they took her away. Heavily pregnant because there is no free speech, right? So that was illegal to do. And so even if there was a very high percentage of Australians that were ready to push back, they would have to do something at a legal, have to change the constitution, bring in a Bill of Rights, put into law free speech. They'd have to do something. And man, there were so many legal court cases that were going through COVID. I donated to a few, and they just all it just failed. It just nothing could get traction. Nothing could get traction. It's very disheartening. Anyway, that was a long answer, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like the system built on a lot of trust and a lot of goodwill that had accrued over time, where people had been willing to give over more and more of their power to the government, because the government seemed to be serving them well. And really, this represents a major betrayal of that trust.
Absolutely.
For a lot of people who see it the way that you're describing. And, it's really interesting, the QR codes and the app and the checking in at all the places and allowing yourself to be tracked and surveilled. If I'm remembering the timeline correctly, because it's similar here, it was similar. We had certain like Vax passes and things where you couldn't go into some restaurant. Or all of the county, just south of the county that I live in, was requiring establishments to check vaccines status in order to let you in and make you mask to the table, but take your mask off at the table, kind of thing. Yeah. So all these things, the timeline, this is not when the initial thing happened. So like this virus comes out, everybody's uncertain about what's going on. There's these lockdowns and stuff. And on some level, I can almost understand that. I still don't agree with the government suppressing people's movement the way that they did. But you can understand this like tightening down of maybe there's something out there that's contagious. So we should all just kind of hide from that and stay inside or stop moving about as freely. But when these surveillance programs were rolled out, there's so much hypocrisy in it because you're allowed to go about and do all your daily things, all the normal things, go socialize, go to a bar or a pub or a restaurant or whatever, go shopping, as long as you're checking in with the government every step of the way or presenting your papers. And so it's like you said, this sort of veneer of this is for the virus, this is to track this virus, but we're acting like we're not afraid of the virus. The virus is just the excuse for the surveillance. And so if the government or whoever big data wanted to track you, they would use an excuse for that. And
sure,
so it's just
right.
like, this was the excuse. They wouldn't just say, now we're going to start tracking you. They'd have to give some reason. This was that reason. And people, the hypocrisy of that, it was astounding to watch from over here. And I'm sure even more so in a place that was being cracked down on even harder, but just amazing to watch people willing to allow themselves to be surveilled and controlled to the extent that they were being surveilled and controlled when they're acting as if they're not afraid anymore. Anyway.
Yes. Well, that context, that moment in time that you're talking about, it was because of the vaccine, right? That was the argument that they were given, and they were saying that if you're vaccinated, then you can't transmit COVID. It's not possible.
But that was
we knew
not true.
Anyone who was looking at the literature, anyone that was following, people say, well, in retrospect, we now realize that it was transmissible. But like they'd done studies, and it was well known. Again, anyone who was looking, that they didn't actually study to see if it was stopping transmission. That wasn't part of the studies that the companies did. The tracking that I'm talking about.
And if that were the case, I would say, sorry to interrupt you, I just want to add to that if that were the case, then there would have also been a parallel track for people who had already had the infection.
Absolutely.
So that would have been another exemption, but that was not, those people were not exempted from the requirements or the vaccine, even though there was a lot of evidence that the vaccine was more dangerous for people who'd already had a COVID infection. But.
Yes, absolutely. The period that I was talking about with our tracking was pre-vaccines.
Okay.
So what they were doing were they were trying to track it, and they did, right? They did actually quite successfully keep it small, especially in Melbourne. Like I said, they were so locked down. They did actually successfully keep it under control, and if there was an outbreak, they could get the data once they got to the QR code situation, and they could follow it, right? And so it's a logical system. It makes sense in terms of trying to prevent it, but it's like very short-sighted. And eventually COVID went everywhere, right? They never stopped it. And in the process, they absolutely decimated the Melbourne economy because they kept everyone locked down and they kept tracking it. And they did the same thing in Adelaide. They were tracking it and they were trying to keep it all like locked down. But what was the cost, right? I know a guy personally that took his own life on the first lockdown. He couldn't cope with it. And that's one person I know, but there's thousands of stories of people that miss stuff for what end. I don't call it a pandemic because the only person I know that died was not anything to do with the actual illness, and we knew early on that there were ways of supporting your immune system and treating it and all that. And so in a sense, it was a clever idea, but it was not at all necessary. And eventually the virus just spread like wildfire anyway. I mean, I've had it twice, and lots of people have. So for me, that's why I was like, okay, this is an excuse to track us because the threat's not substantial. And I hear what you're saying. Like, really, at the very beginning, some people were scared and we didn't understand what was going on. Okay, fair enough. But how long was it? 6 months in, we were all starting to realize. It was pretty quickly established that this isn't going to kill the millions and millions of people that they thought it would.
That they were projecting.
Yeah, that they were projecting. That was already well, 2020, I think we knew that. So, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So, and interesting. I want to ask you about, because we're kind of talking about COVID. We're also talking about these lockdown protests versus the George Floyd protests, and this all of these things are, I guess, all of these different movements. The medical control movement that began around 2020, and also the heightened racial tensions that began around the same time, that like these were things that were in the background simmering but came to a head around the same time, and a lot of people see them differently. Like there are people who are really against some of the COVID controls but are seeing the social justice stuff as pretty mild and reasonable to them, going along with the DEI things. And then there's people who are really concerned about the DEI and social justice movements, but not really worried about the medical control because they see that as sensible measures to, respond to viral attacks or public health measures or whatever. So
Sure.
I've wondered about this. There are also a number of people who find that intersection of those two things concerning and representative of one sort of overall authoritarian movement, I guess. What do you think? And why do you think some people fall on one side but not the other in different ways?
So, yeah, I see them as intersecting. I don't necessarily think. Gosh, it's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, you ask, how do I see it and why? I think at the heart of that is empathy, right? And I think a lot of what we're experiencing is weaponized empathy, using people's empathy against them. And I have some friends that I talk about this stuff with quite regularly, and I'm the odd one out, right? So I actually love getting a lot of exposure to a more mainstream view is probably the right way to put it, in friends that I love and care about, and we talk about stuff often. And it was only recently I was trying to explain my view, because whenever I talk, these friends will often, and people in general will often think, oh, Dan thinks it was all perfectly planned, sculptured, and by some shadowy, unnamed, invisible group, right? And it's like you make one comment and they go, oh, that's how he thinks it is. And then the only other option is any issues or any problems is incompetence. And it's been a long, arduous process for me to get to the point where I feel like I personally have a view, because I'm like, I'm hearing this, I'm hearing that, and I have friends that are like really kind of on the other end of the whole conspiracy side of thing, and I absorb information from both. And my personal view is that there's a whole bunch of what was the word I used? Incompetence. Well, this quote, don't ascribe to malice something which can be explained by incompetence. I think there's a lot of incompetence. I also know that in society we have around about 3% psychopaths. And I think a lot of what people are missing when they're doing a calculation on what is happening in society is they fundamentally do not understand what psychopathy is. They're so trapped in their own experience of being a generally caring, empathetic human being that they actually can't remove themselves from that vantage point to walk over and look at it from another angle and go, what would it be like to be a person that has no empathy, that has no conscience? And if I was a person that had no conscience, what would I do? And we know from the data that, psychopaths are statistically overrepresented in powerful positions. And so for me, I think a lot of what's going on, whether it be the COVID context or whether it be the DEI context, is there's a lot of opportunistic psychopaths that really don't care. and that will do whatever they need to get power, influence, whatever. And I think there's a whole bunch of really good-hearted, good-intended people that are misled. I love the subline from Jonathan Haidt's book. I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt. He's written a few books, and he wrote this book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And he has the, so, and you're nodding, you know it, right? He has a subtitle which is why good intentions and bad ideas are destroying a generation. And for me, I see that as the most gracious. It's not like, oh, there's woke idiots and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, what's actually happening here? What's the phenomenon here? Because we can't conclude that half the country are just stupid, right? We can't conclude that half the country are not psychopaths. And so I think there's good intentions married with bad ideas mixed with, some planning, right? And some people without conscience that has gotten us to the point that we're at. And, you know, we often talk about toxic masculinity and masculine values, but we don't talk much about toxic femininity and feminine values. And, you know, I think there's a toxic expression of both. You need a balance between, and we don't need to delve into the complicated world of the masculine and the feminine, but if you're thinking of empathy, right, and nurture and care and compassion, and that generally comes under the category of like a feminine thing. I'm a counselor, right? I love empathy and compassion, but it can be weaponized, and people can. I think really good people have been hoodwinked into buying into things that aren't really what they appear to be on the surface.
That's really interesting. I really I would love to hear more about the toxic femininity from you. I'm picturing like the devouring mother archetype, and then the sort of like the nanny state that seems like you're describing with Australian politics, which I guess, and I don't know if this is kind of crass, but the first thought I had wasn't mothering. It was like almost, and I apologize for this metaphor, but almost pimping. Like, you know, give me your check and I'll give you what you need to keep you dependent on me. So you'll keep working and giving me money. So that's a different archetype altogether, if it even qualifies as an archetype, but it's a different paradigm for sure. But I'm interested in that, and I don't mind delving into the masculine and feminine because I think those are really useful. They're very useful pictures to paint.
Yeah, probably my apprehension is that you know, that little thing I was sharing before was, you know, the way my personality works is it does take me a long time to feel like I conclude because I'm quite open-minded and I'm like, okay, what am I missing? What am I not getting? The right's telling me something. The left's telling me something. I'm absolutely convinced there's truth in both. I want to get the truth from both. That's why I love the name of your channel, right? The Radical Center. It speaks to where I feel I'm very in the center, and that's a radical way to be. And I don't feel like I've fully landed the plane yet on understanding at least what I mean, or at least what I think those two terms mean. So I struggle to put it into words. It's kind of more of a thing that's evolving at the moment. I was talking to a friend about this recently, and he was speaking to that. But I'm absolutely convinced that a chunk of what we're experiencing, and I've got to say what I've experienced since I've come to the US, is a more feminized culture. Again, that's not a bad thing, but when does that go too far? And what I've noticed coming here is that the men that I meet, I've often had a bit of a hard time building connections with men back in Australia. I'm not stereotypically masculine. I'm not big into sport. There's a few aspects of me which works, but traditionally to connect with men. But traditionally, I've not fit the mold. And since I've come here, I connect with men more easily. I'm finding that the men here are more. And I knew this actually before because I've had a lot of interactions with Americans over the years, but they're kinder, they're softer. And I'm in Minnesota, so we get the Minnesota nice phenomenon. And it's been lovely. But on the contrary, I can also see that a lot of them are beaten down.
Hmm.
They've got a lack of confidence and groundedness in their sense of self, and I think it is a flow-on effect from all the narratives out there about toxic masculinity or masculine privilege, male privilege, and all this sort of stuff. And so that's been pushed down, whilst on the same time the other side, the other values are being pushed up. And I know for a long time I was like, unconsciously, my view on what does a man doing emotions better look like, and I would have never said this out loud, but it was like, oh, men just need to be more like women, right? Men are too emotionally cut off. True. What do? Well, they need to be more like women. And it was a while back I heard someone say, men do emotions differently to women. And I thought, yeah, that's true. I want to see men that are connected to themselves, that are grounded, that are emotionally intelligent, that can cry, that can express themselves, but just out and out rejecting their masculinity and their masculine traits to then embody femininity and feminine traits. It doesn't work. And I think that the best kept secret that no one's really talking about, the elephant in the room, is that women don't find that attractive. Man who just shows up like a woman, most women don't find that attractive. And I've worked with enough couples, and we touch on these sort of subjects, and they're like, no, I want him to have an opinion, I want him to stand up for himself. They don't want an arsehole, right? But there's a lot of room between arsehole who just does whatever he wants, and I meet those, and pushover that has no backbone and that only ever wants to be compassionate, empathetic, and never push their own, let's say, agenda or their own desires. And that is something I've noticed a contrast in Australia. We get, I get more of this, right? Assholes, or so the men are more masculine. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's probably a roundabout way of saying that too much femininity where it becomes authoritarian and bitchy, right? Bitchy and back. I mean, what's cancellation? What's cancellation? Cancellation's not a masculine phenomenon. What would a man do? He'd go punch him in the nose, right? He wouldn't whisper behind, oh, I'm going to ring the employers and I'm going to get them fired. That's a feminine type of an energy. So I think the pendulum swung. We don't want everyone punching someone in the nose or wars, right? I mean, that's a very, but we don't want bitching and backstabbing and this overly, like everyone's walking around on eggshells, because everyone's scared, like, oh, what's happening? And everyone's whispering behind, So maybe I do have more thoughts on the toxic femininity than I realized I could kind of articulate. And it's something that I'm passionate about as a counsellor, because I want to see a healthy, I'm very Jungian. I want to see a healthy integration of the masculine and the feminine. We all have both in us. I'm really feminine. I also like to listen to heavy metal and ride electric skateboards, right? And to pick a stereotype, of course, women can do that too. But in my younger days, I punched people, like as a teenager, not something I'm proud of. But, so it's like, I never used to understand what's happening for me. I'm some weirdo. And it's like, no, it's good to have both. We need both. So I embrace that now, but once upon a time, I was a bit confused by that. And I think that's the thing that makes me sad, is that, we're having a phenomenon now of tomboys becoming extinct. If a girl or a woman shows male traits, well, she must be a man. Maybe she's trans, right? Like, I always got along well at school with tomboy girls, like, and I'm whatever you would call the equivalent of a man. I'm kind of like that. I'm like the male version of it, like, I always got along with the girls. I always like talking about emotions. I never had a problem crying. So Yeah.
That's really fascinating, and I think that there's so much still to explore there. And I feel like something you said about being really open and not necessarily coming quickly to conclusions for yourself, but rather just being open to exploring things, that really resonates and for with me. And I feel like as you're talking about that, I want to go down so many different tangents, and I start to think, well, yeah, and that kind of answers this, but then I'm like, no, there maybe there's a counter.
Absolutely.
It just feels like there's so much richness in that way of
Absolutely.
conceptualizing things, and I appreciate you just dipping a toe into
Mm,
that.
mm,
Something I really appreciate also is when you're talking about not writing people off so simply for their beliefs, and not chalking up the compliance with the whatever you want to call it, the cultural
mm,
movements that we're seeing,
mm,
not
mm,
chalking that up to some kind of moral failing or
mm,
personality failing in a
mm,
person, but
mm.
rather it's just people people do have their own reasons for being hooked in or going along with certain things. I
Mm, mm,
I I appreciate that. I think that it's really easy to call people names or dismiss them, or this whole thing about sheep, and
yeah, yeah.
the names that we call people for going along with the things that we are concerned about.
Mm,
They can
mm,
be very dismissive,
yes.
and you're right. Weaponized empathy is a really good way to look at it, because there is
Mm,
certainly,
mm,
you see a lot of this what looks like misguided and misdirected compassion. This kind of almost, you watch these people who are at these. I've seen recently these trans rights protesters who are protesting speakers and things, and you almost get this like mama bear energy, like we're protecting the thing that we picture when we picture this vulnerable group or this vulnerable
absolutely.
individual. And so it's a sense that you almost, there's a schema in their mind of what they're protecting, and it's different than the schema in my mind, that I would protect it from a different angle. I would feel
Yes,
protective in a different way, but that motivation in there isn't something that's just so easily dismissed and maligned.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good impulse. It's just being directed at the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the easy and lazy path to just think, oh, everyone that disagrees with me is wrong and they're evil, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
as I said earlier, like half the country, well, it's not half, but left and right is close to half. You can't have half a country that's evil,
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's truth in both sides.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. I mean, people have probably heard me say this a bunch of times because it was a really shocking moment for me. But when my faculty advisor at my graduate school, when I was training to become a counselor, told me that they knew that they weren't training counselors who would be able to work with Trump supporters. We know we are no longer training counselors who can work with the Trump supporters, what she said. And to me, that was exactly what you're talking about. It's the vilification, demonization, and the dismissal of half the country. Because
Wow.
at this point, you're what even is a Trump supporter is a question, right? Like what?
Totally.
Yeah. So that's
Totally.
its own question to open up,
Mm,
but
mm.
to turn around and do that back is not the way to heal and move forward.
Totally,
So.
totally, and it's so sad for you and I in this world, right? Because we care about the counselling field, and like counselling's just listening. I mean, one-on-one counselling, I mostly do couples. It's quite different, but one-on-one counselling, it's like it's totally irrelevant. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I had a client at the moment, and I'm going to say very little because I just want to, really honour that privacy. But I have a client at the moment who, if you wrote down our beliefs on a sheet of paper, we'd probably diverge nearly everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't bother me in the slightest. I genuinely like the person, and they're
Mm-hmm.
coming back, so I assume they like me too, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're more than our beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So, yeah, I
Yeah,
agree with what you're saying. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, I guess this is a good place to draw to a close because we've been
Yeah.
talking for a while, but I
Sure.
really
Sure.
appreciate it. And I feel like there's so many things that we've discussed that I could ask you more about. And
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
really enjoyed this conversation very much.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me. I haven't done. I said I think off before we started recording. I run a podcast,
Hmm.
and it's not video, and we edit it. So
Hmm.
doing this is new, and it's good for me because I've been wanting to get into doing some video content. Maybe I'll plug just quickly the
Yeah,
podcast,
please
which
do.
is
And any links that you want to direct people to as well, if you
yeah,
have a
yeah.
personal website or anything. So
Yep.
yeah, please.
So and maybe you can include this because my accent always confuses people. But my website is danielanear.com. So www.danielanear.com. And yeah, you can find what I do. It's a new website, so it's got all the details on there. You can book in. I work with couples a lot, but I also work with people around personality typology. I really, really know the Myers-Briggs system
Mm,
well at this point. I've worked with a lot of people on that now. I also know the Enneagram.
yeah.
Um, Not as well, but I know it well. That was the most transformative thing for me personally, learning my Enneagram type. And I do work with a percentage of men around sort of life transitions as well. Quite passionate about transitions from the first to second half of life and that kind
Mm.
of world. And then in terms of my podcast, it's called Convergently Speaking. And it's what we're talking about, right? I'm passionate about seeing how things converge. Where's the convergence of ideas? How can we bring some unity? The podcast isn't. When I named it, I was like, oh, I'm going to do this philosophy podcast with. It's like I'm not a philosopher, right? I can't do that. It's mostly around personal growth and personality type, and more recently, we've gone more directly into relationships. So I do all sorts of topics and have guests on looking at relationships and how you can improve your relationship with yourself and your relationship with others as well. So yeah, feel free to check that out. And yeah, if people want to send me an email, it's just hello@danielanear.com. But you can easily do that through my website as well.
Excellent. Well, I'll include all of those links in the description under the video. So if anybody wants to check those out, please do. And thank you again,
Great.
Daniel.
Awesome.
It's been
Thank
really
you.
great to speak with you.
Yeah, no, it's been really good. Thank you.